Today we're going to be going over the meaning of life and why there is more to life than just our norm of eating or sleeping, working a 9 to 5 for 40 years, never affording a home, retiring when we're old and decrepit, and then just dying. Welcome to session 1 of Living Over Surviving. My name is Noah, and one thing that was posed to me, or one question that was posed to me that was really quite succinct and really captured the essence of what this whole thing is about is, could you help me understand why life feels empty, right? Like, what's the meaning of it? Because some people, a lot of people out there, don't really feel as if their lives are worth living, or if there's really a point to going through all this hassle. And the answer is yes, as to why we could answer why it feels empty. And so one thing I'd like to start with is what we think of when we think of a decent life. Right? Usually we think about a particular set of milestones. Maybe that's a career. Maybe it's a relationship. Hopefully a happy marriage, right? Maybe it's buying a house, you get the white picket fence, all that. Let's say you could afford it in this scenario. But let's start to think about what our lives would actually look like once we have everything that we want, right? So in this hypothetical, we wake up, we go to work, we get home, have dinner, see some friends here and there, not obviously in the same day, every day, but we go to some family functions whenever they come up. Maybe we're going to be looking forward to the weekends or vacation. Then once those are done, we're just going to be looking for the next weekend or vacation. Or maybe instead of a vacation or time off, it's a particular material, right? Like maybe it's the new phone or the next big thing, right? Maybe it's your next drink at the end of the day, whatever. But at the end of it all, there's going to be this common theme of always looking for something else, right? And so once we usually get that thing, we start looking to the next one. And it's just this cycle. Usually it's been called the hedonic treadmill. But when we try to make ourselves more comfortable and we have all these goals, we actually end up suffering because of that. Because then once we're actually in the process of getting goals and then going for more goals, it's just this cycle of gratification that we mentally isolate ourselves into, right? And when all we do is chase pleasures, things, or experiences, nothing over time ever really becomes enough, right? Because once we get it, we just shift the goalposts to whatever we want next. And the same thing can also happen with our achievements, right? Now, forgive me, I don't remember this author's name. If I do find out, I will put it in the show notes. But I remember this podcast interview with a New York Times bestselling author. And he was recounting how he actually found out that he was a best-selling author. And he was mowing the lawn at the time, and his agent kind of just called him up. And so he picked up the phone and said, "Oh my gosh, so-and-so, you made it to X spot on the New York Times bestseller list. Isn't this great?" And he said, "Yeah, well, thanks for letting me know." But then he went on to say that he's like, "Okay, well, I'm in the middle of mowing my lawn. And so what did I do right after? I finished mowing the lawn." Right? And so usually when we think of getting these achievements, instances like that really highlight how even if we hold something in high regard or we idealize a certain status that's associated with whatever that achievement brings, it doesn't change us in the moment. And it's never that profound change that at least we in the background think it is. And I think that this is a pretty common sentiment, even among YouTubers, right? I forget, obviously, terrible with names. But I know that YouTubers, when they achieve high heights, like let's say 1 million subs or something like that, they'll say about how it feels the same as if it were 10K, right? Like, to us, it feels proportionally the same. But then, obviously, our goalposts get moved. And it's not necessarily that profound change between 10K or a million. It still feels the same to us. And overall, once we've completed a few of these cycles, I would say, of going out and getting these achievements, or getting whatever we sought after, or doing whatever we wanted to do, it becomes really evident that even if we get all the things that we want, at least in the moment, that we could still be unhappy, because then we're just looking for the next thing. Once I get this job, then I'll be happy. Once I get this relationship, that girlfriend, their boyfriend, I'll be happy, right? But then once we actually get to that level and we're in that situation, it just doesn't hit the same as it did in our heads. And so one thing that I think is really useful in the moment to remember when we find ourselves in this situation and we want to avoid that cycle for ourselves is that even the rich or famous, maybe both, off themselves. They have such idealized lives, at least on the exterior, right? Sure, they have tons of money, but they also have tons of problems, right? Drug problems, in and out of rehab. They have scandals, hopping from one failed relationship to another. And just like with everything else, that novelty will wear off. And we just start looking for the next thing. And I don't really know if we can say that we wouldn't be prone to those same things if we were in that same position. Because typically, these aren't the things that we include in our ideas of a good life. But the problem is that those things that they succumb to, essentially, are immediate and apparent and are in very large abundances when you are of that status or do get to that level of wealth. And so maybe the things that we want in the moment right now are a bit simpler, like a better sleep schedule, or being able to afford a home, or more time with family if you like your family, whatever it may be. Maybe it's more alone time. But when we look at the lives of the rich and we see that they're also in that same cycle, it really puts into perspective that maybe whatever we're looking towards isn't the be-all end-all, because then we're just going to move the goalposts and find ourselves trapped within that cycle, right? So money or fame, for sure, definitely are attractive, but they're not sure shots to happiness alone. And that's where the emptiness really comes, because then everything we've tried so far, or at least what people typically pursue, don't actually get us the fulfillment that we're chasing. And we have all the goals in the world, and even in our own lives, when you've achieved goals, chances are it isn't that profound change. And then what do? Because it's never going to be good enough, you're looking for the next one. At least, even after a time of short celebration. And that's why people with tons of resources are still prone to depression or offing themselves. It's this cycle. And so I think it's really important to think about what we think of when we try to envision a happy life. And so I think that we really got to think about, or rather, think outside the box. Because happiness clearly, once we actually conceptualize that cycle and we can envision ourselves and apply that to our own lives. Because maybe it's not that relationship, or maybe it wasn't getting that job, or maybe it wasn't moving to that particular place or having that particular item. Happiness isn't doing, having, or achieving whatever we want. And that's a big hurdle to get through. And so if whatever we've done so far for ourselves isn't working, maybe we just gotta think a little differently about it. And I'm reminded of this conversation I had back in university. Decently smart girl in college. She went to a Catholic high school and took religion and philosophy courses all 4 years. So great, fantastic. She said that it made a huge impact on her life and it sounded promising, right? Like I was assuming that I was going to hear something like, something kind of profound. But then she went on to tell me that all her ideas came from a human sexuality class. And I was like, oh, okay, well, what kind of value did you get from it? And quoting the conversation, she said, because I have it here, basically, the path to happiness is to continuously do things that are healthy that increase dopamine. I mean, while it sounds stupid typing it out, maybe it is stupid. But I feel like the more you do things that give you a small spark of pleasure, the more happy you will be. And then she went on with like achievement, community, things like that, which are better for sure. But at the end of it all, even after being exposed to all those allegedly good things that should give her like some sort of profound insight, her main takeaway was hedonism. And that is one of the most dog shit takes you could ever have. And so if we're struggling with someone who does think hedonism has some kind of inherent value or is a pretty solid direction for someone to embark towards, you could just very quickly tell them this. And so after she told me her garbage take, I said, well, if dopamine rushes are happiness, if I strap you to a hospital bed and then pump you full of dopamine or whatever drugs you want, would that be a happy life? And she said, no, of course. When I put it like that, and then she said, oh, okay, well, I never really thought about it that way. But it's all because of some knuckle dragger teacher who should have known better. It's weird because that's exactly the cycle that you're going to find yourself isolated to, right? Hedonists are drug addicts, essentially. And no one thinks drug addicts are happy or live meaningful lives, right? And it's people like this and conversations like this that demonstrate just how easy it is to get misled. And it's really heartbreaking once we think long term. Because then imagine that you lived your life essentially walking down that path that you were recommended to by, well, society or someone you trusted or someone who was supposed to teach you better, and you found nothing there for you at the end. And that's not necessarily your fault either, right? And that's just a real shame. It sucks because it's a toss-up as to whether the person who instilled that value in you even knew better for themselves. And when we find ourselves at the end of that road, if we're just going through that cycle throughout our lives, that's very easily where suicide would become appealing, or where depression could creep in. Because all the things that you thought could bring you happiness simply didn't. And once we realize that, it isn't really clear what could get us there. And I'm of the opinion that terrible approaches to happiness make problems just like this. And so I'd like to share with you, the Journal of Adolescent Health conducted a survey between the 2011 and 2018 academic years with 610,000 undergraduates averaging the age of 21. And so they reported suicide attempts more than doubled from 2013 to 2018. Severe depression rose from 9.4% to 21.1% in the same period. Moderate to severe depression rose from 23.2% in 2007 to 41.1% in 2018. And the suggested causes in this study were smartphone use, poor sleep quality, and fewer face-to-face interactions. But at the end of the day, I think, in my opinion, anyways, that those answers are pretty insufficient. And so let's go through each one of them. Sleep quality has always been kind of up in the air with undergrads, and it's kind of the status quo. So if you've been there, obviously you're well aware of it, right? It's practically tradition. And so it doesn't explain the sharp rise in these trends, because people from all or most recent generations, even ones predating 2011 and even the ones after 2018, they're all going to have a similar experience. And I don't think it explains the sharp rise in the trends. And like, you're either taking naps during the day in addition to sleeping at night, or you're pulling all-nighters for midterms, or, you know, that project that you left to the last day. Sleep quality comes in waves. And so that's essentially what I'm saying. To blame this crazy increase on sleep quality is just kind of bullshit. Face-to-face interactions is also one that came up. The problem I have with that is that we are more connected than ever because of our smartphone use, right? And you don't really need face-to-face interactions to feel connected nowadays. Like, if you have online friends or participate in any sort of community online in any capacity, that kind of suffices. You know, I'm not going to say it completely suffices, because it's always good to have some degree of physical interaction with people. But if you have no one to talk to online, or you're not putting yourself out there, even on the online space, chances are you're not going to be doing the same thing in real life anyways. Because then you'd still be using all these same platforms to talk to the people that you know in real life anyways. So, if anything, I think that what they were getting at is reasonable. They could have said it was loneliness, but specifically face-to-face interactions, I think it's insufficient. Especially when tons of the Zoomers nowadays have social anxiety, right? They're all speaking online. I'm not sure if that sharp increase could be attributed to that. And now for smartphone use. And this one could work. But we got to remember that we can all use our devices for a lot of good things as well. And the kinds of media that we consume can absolutely change our lives. And so it really depends on what we're consuming, and not necessarily simply that we're using our phones. Like, sure, we can get into social media and get sucked in to rabbit holes and start comparing ourselves to others, and our self-esteem could certainly take a hit. But I think that could only ever be a symptom of a poor sense of self, right? That's an insecurity. And we'll cover insecurities in the future, but to attribute that phenomenon simply to smartphone use as a blanket statement is also insufficient. I stopped at a bachelor's, so it's okay if you think I'm full of shit. But as I see it, the problem is that we don't really have anything in our lives that trumps the perceived value of just dicking around on our phones, pretty much. And so this comes from a lack of clarity, as I see it, on multiple fronts. Because if we had a strong sense of self, or we were secure in ourselves, we were emotionally developed and stable, and had some semblance of direction, then we wouldn't really be experiencing these phenomena at the rates that we are. These crazy increases in depression or increases in suicide attempts, those are larger underlying issues that specifically relate to our mental health and how we are, I guess, appropriating relationships with these different things. If we had a strong sense of self, we did have that security in ourselves, we did have that wherewithal about getting clarity in our lives, I don't think we'd ever actually get sucked into the rabbit holes, and we wouldn't have this sharp rise, and we wouldn't need to use various things to escape or waste time or procrastinate. And sure, we could do it out of pleasure because it's fun to do it. Absolutely. It is an entertaining time doing all those things, wasting our time on Instagram or TikTok or anything like that. But when we envision someone with a meaningful life, we typically don't imagine them to have a lot of void fillers, right? They're not scrolling on TikTok for half the day, even though it is a fun thing to do, right? They're not having short-term casual relationships that don't really go anywhere, or a bunch of situationships per year. There's no escaping from problems with drugs, alcohol, porn, Netflix, whatever, right? It could be really good or really bad. It doesn't matter. Internally, we know that these things don't really help us, and they don't really take away the problem. We're just kind of pushing it away or just saying, oh, okay, well, who cares? We'll cover it next time. And I think this really just comes from a lack of clarity. And if we have that clarity, we would certainly be put, I guess, more so into the state where we could tackle these things and be a bit more forthcoming. So if we want to get that clarity, let's start with the meaning of life, because then once we have clarity on that, then it changes our frame of mind on how we approach pretty much everything. Because then we won't want to check out and just be fine with whatever's immediate and apparent. Like, that is the state of life that we really want to avoid, right? When we start to resort to TikTok, Insta, porn, drugs, alcohol, whatever, right? At the end of the day, what we're doing when we use those things as a means of escape, or when we feel as if we need them to cope with our lives very generally, we're strapping ourselves to those hospital beds. And all of these forms are really just forms of anesthesia, right? Whether mental or emotional, depending on whatever we're looking at the time. And although it seems intuitive and attractive to use these things because obviously it's entertaining, or it's a distraction from pain, this temporary release isn't something that makes us truly happy. And obviously we know this. Because then we start to look for that next session, and the one after that, and then the one after that, trying to push away the negativity as best we can. And so one thing that I'd like to call to mind or put into perspective is that everything we do and every decision we make, we do so with happiness in mind, right? If something isn't going to bring us happiness, or at least closer to it, we're simply not going to do it. And this is going to be a constant in everyone's lives. And this is something we all consider from every walk of life. Because happiness is something that everyone chases, regardless of how they search. It's the paramount destination to us. The goal or the meaning of life is to finally be happy. So now it really comes down to where we think that happiness lies, and what forms of happiness are actually suitable for long-term satisfaction, right? Maybe we think it's a relationship, or maybe some of us think that it's the dopamine hits, right? But if it were relationships, then anyone in one would be the happiest around. But that's hardly the case, right? Look at our divorce rates, for example. And if it's for dopamine, then we'd be fine with the hospital bed. But we know intuitively that it's not a happy life or a meaningful one. And so we've seen that happiness isn't really doing, having, or achieving anything we want. But then what options are we really left with if it's nothing we actually want? And that next step to find out is to start looking at things that we don't immediately want to do or think about or find intuitively attractive. And that's what we'll cover in session 2. Or if you want, you could just go to episode 0. But we'll cover it in more depth in session 2. Have a good night.